Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House, brings you Voices of Justice, a series of podcasts where law enforcement officials, judges, and advocates come together to unravel the entangled web of domestic violence. Join us as we dive into the complex challenges faced by those on the front lines of justice, exploring real-life stories, legal nuances, and the human side of these cases. In each episode, our guests share their experiences, insights, and perspectives, shedding light on the multifaceted nature of domestic violence. Tune in for a compelling journey into the criminal justice system, where compassion meets the pursuit of truth and where professionals strive to bring justice to those affected by the cycle of abuse. I'm your host, Tina Johnson, Community Partnership Manager, alongside my co-host, Mary Ann Matheny, CEO of Hope House, Eileen Sheehan, COO of Hope House, and Randa Hager, Director of Outreach Services. Welcome to Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House. Chief Adam Dustman grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. He is married to his wife, Sara. They have two boys, Ayden 9 and Owen 7. Adam is a graduate of the University of Central Missouri with a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice. After graduation in 2007, Adam began to work in Independence, Missouri by taking a position as a paraprofessional at Independence Academy within the Independence School District. While working for the school district in 2008, Adam pursued his lifelong dream of becoming a police officer by applying within and being hired by the Independence Police Department. After being hired, Adam attended and graduated from the Kansas City Regional Police Academy, which he earned the award for class valedictorian. In 2017, Adam was promoted to the rank of captain. As captain, Adam commanded a shift within the patrol division. On August 8, 2002, after 14 years of continuous service, Adam was named the Chief of Police, Independence, Missouri Police Department, where he proudly continues to serve today. Chief Dustman, welcome to the Illuminating Hope podcast. We're glad you're here.
Well, thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. It's reported that over a half of the assaults that happen in the Independence, Missouri area are considered domestic violence. Tell our listeners how the co-responder program has helped with another level of response.
So I would say that's a conservative estimate. I would say even probably over half. But the co-responder program and the relationship that we have with Hope House has been instrumental in providing services to victims that didn't otherwise have access to those services, especially early on. As we know, the cycle of violence and the cycle of abuse takes on many forms. We think of it when we talk about assaults, the physical form, but there's the emotional form, there's the psychological form, there's the financial form that become dependent on financial well-being. And so all of that takes a toll. And so the earlier that we can intervene and we can provide that resource to services, the outreach, it just helps all the way around, not only for recidivism and hoping to get those victims to self-sufficiency. We hope that also gets them out of that and break the cycle of violence. So through the co-responder program and the relationship with Hope House, we've been able to provide an advocate that actually responds out, the co-responder model, and actually goes on scene with these victims and engages them where they are. And we found that that's been really helpful and beneficial for us because sometimes victims, not only just the trauma that they have endured or the crisis of the moment, the police sometimes have an image when they come across that isn't as inviting or welcoming in those environments. So this gives somebody that they're comfortable with, that understands those shared experiences, has training and expertise in that area, and can really provide that link and that linchpin into providing them and getting them engaged with services, which is huge.
What happens then after the domestic violence call? What's the follow-up look like?
The follow-up would be mainly meet the client where they're at. So assess the situation. What does the client need? What does that look like? I mean, is it come in the form of an order of protection? Does it come in the form of I need resources? Do I need shelter? So it's really just what we do every single day. And sometimes we just do it naturally because it seems natural to us and go into that safety planning mode. And so that could look very different for each individual victim that we work with, but really just assessing the situation and keeping that connection, not only the connection with the victim, but keeping that victim connected to the police department as well. That's really important when we're looking at prosecution, when we're looking at follow-up statements and things like that.
To jump onto that, Randa, too, and I know Eileen and Mary Ann can both speak to this, but the justice advocacy part of that and the relationship and the partnership with Hope House is huge, too, because that court process, a lot of times, and now more than ever, takes takes a really long time. So a lot of times, especially in today's society where we want that instant gratification, we expect immediate results, and sometimes, as we find, it's going to take a while to get through that. So they have that advocate, they have that partner to walk alongside them where they are and get them through and guide them through that process.
I think another important aspect to talk about is not just what the victim needs, but what does the victim want?
Right.
Because that often can seem very confusing to people who don't understand the dynamics of domestic violence, because it may seem like, oh, the best thing to do is to leave, and that may not be where that person is. So can you talk about how you, in terms of the police department, that is one of the things we hear constantly, is that the officers are frustrated or don't know what to do because they don't understand that. So any thoughts about that you have?
I think that is spot on. So obviously, just like any profession, but especially true in law enforcement, you have job fatigue. We see people oftentimes in their worst moments and at their worst moments in life a lot of times. And so we're trained and very compassionate most of the time to be able to guide them through that. But just like anything else, that repeated exposure, you become numb or you become desensitized to that. And so a lot of times it can come across to a victim as a lack of compassion or a lack of empathy. And equally to the officer, it can also manifest itself in frustration, which is the stigma that Randa and Eileen have done such a good job that when we train our officers and bring them in and do that introduction to Hope House and the services that are provided there, it's important because we have to continually remind them, listen, you're going to see these over and over again. And people, regardless of the situation and the fact that you may see them as a repeat offender or a repeat victim and a repeat call for service, you can't get frustrated with that because you're exactly right. They may not be in a place. We talked about financial. That may be the only stable life that they have is that house. And they know because the psychology of abuse and the way abusers tend to orchestrate and set things up from a control perspective, they put everything in their name. They have all of that financial control, whether that be property or possessions. And especially when you add kids in custody and using that as a trigger and leverage to hold over somebody's head to continue victimizing them, it's really important that we continually remind ourselves that even though we may not have lived those experiences, it's not just as easy as, well, if you really didn't like this, you just get up and leave. Well, that's easy to say from the outside looking in, but that's not reality.
Eileen and Chief Dustman, because of the co-responder program, what kind of outcomes have we seen at Hope House? Have we seen through the police department as far as more victims go to court or any other outcomes?
Just kind of picking up back off of what Chief Dustman said, the crisis of the moment. So that's what police respond to is that 911 call, is that incident. And then that advocate is bringing the what next to the scene. So they're able to get them into, as Randa said, therapy, support groups, counseling, all of that stuff. But what we're seeing is that people are getting out of these situations. We have to remember it is a process. It did not happen overnight. They did not get in this relationship after one date. They will not get out of this situation with one police call. So it is a process. And that is what Hope House does, is help folks walk through the process. So we're seeing them come into support groups. We do see them to come into therapy, needing legal services. They'll still have our information from the last time and call back the advocate and said, I wasn't ready last, July when you showed up, but now it's December and I think it's time for me to get out. It's getting bad. So making those connections, it's a life and death connection, and the police and Hope House partnership in that is the best thing in the whole wide world, if you ask me. Yes. And it's the only co-responding program for domestic violence in the state of Missouri that I am aware of.
I can't agree more. One of the things that we have found, you talk about the outcomes, the measurables. Definitely we see more participation in the court process because of that advocate and that guide that's there to kind of usher you through. So that's always important. It also is empowering for our victims to be able to take some control back, whereas before there was oftentimes from our standpoint, you just have a date and you show up to appear. Well, that's really hard psychologically and emotionally to get that courage to really get up there and take some control back. So it is a process. We are seeing more repeat offenders, persistent offenders through the quarterly meetings that we do with Hope House and the reviews that we do, our revisits. Again, everything that we've talked about today, it may not be immediate engagement in services that night, but maybe the next month they're in a different place. And it may be a want or a need or a desire that we can fill, even if it's just, hey, you've got somebody in your corner. There's somebody here for you. If you ever get to a point, may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but if you need that lifeline and you throw that life preserver out there, I'm waiting for you on the other side.
And I think these different type of response, whether it's the co-responder, you talked about the revisits that the advocates do, the detective, the lethality assessment, these are all different ways to reach folks. So if it doesn't connect with the co-responders there, but there's another call and there's a lethality assessment done, and then when they hear Hope House again, that might just be that key that's needed in order to get somebody out of that situation. So it's just not one approach. There's just not one answer in how this is going to turn out. There's lots of different ways, and we have have to be able to be flexible with doing that. And when you talk about meeting somebody where they are, that's what you have to do, is have multiple approaches.
And I'll add one success story we had specifically since we started the co-responder program. I'm just going to read this. This is a reflection from them. It says, due to the collaboration with IPD, I was able to get to a client quickly and efficiently and assist with filling out an order of protection. My client was granted a full order of protection. Since then, my client has been able to obtain a job and a steady income to support themselves. My client was able to separate from their abuser and has been able to live their life freely over the last few months. I mean, ultimately, that is the ultimate success story. Not to say that we weren't doing great work before, because we have a long-standing relationship with Hope House and the work that we do in our community, but this is just one more level to amplify that. And so if we can repeat those success stories, just the amount of impact that we're having in the community is tremendous.
There's so many myths when it comes to orders of protection. Tell our listeners the value of that piece of paper, the tool for the officers to use.
So like anything else, we always tell people the order of protection is important because it starts that documentation trail and it starts that record. It backs up when you have an incident and you say, okay, something happened, whether it be physical, whether it be verbal, whatever that is. If there was an incident and then it just shows, hey, here's that next step. They felt so in fear and needed this order from a court. A court has looked at it with a degree of scrutiny and a judge says, yes, this is there. Ultimately, at the end of the day, one of the things that we hear a lot is, well, it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't really protect, not going to stop a punch. You're right. But it gives us the tool to be able to go back and have that enforceable order that would allow us to then take enforcement and maybe make that arrest that stops that cycle, maybe makes that arrest that stops and saves a life. And I'm really excited. I'll share a success story that actually started with an order of protection here in a little bit. I think we'll get to that. But when I share this, I'm saving that for the end because that's, I'm going to do my mic drop and walk out. That is the real life scenario that started with an order of protection that allowed us to really make a difference, an impactful difference, not only for getting somebody dangerous off the streets in our community, but getting a victim to self-sufficiency in an otherwise situation where they've been years and years and years of just trapped in this never-ending cycle.
I'm wondering if you both, Ayden and Chief, if you could talk about what led us to create the co-responder program. Because as you said, Chief Dustman, we have been working together for 30 years and have continued to improve on the services that we are able to provide as partners. But we took it to that next level. So can you talk a little bit about what drove that?
Well, we found a grant that allowed us to have it. But what we were finding is that based upon our persistent offenders that we have in Independence, there is a list of those. And when an incident was happening, one of those residents, the on-call advocate and detective were responding out. And what we were finding is that there is more of a window of opportunity to connect with somebody sooner rather than 2 or 3 days later. We had that specifically for the response team for those persistent offenders. So we were able to take that actually to another level. Again, first time anybody in the state of Missouri has such a thing, where we said, well, let's try this. We found a grant that would pay for it. And then officers would have the advocate available right then and there. So she rides around with them and then go to the domestic violence calls and makes that connection right then and there. Just another level of that window of opportunity before it closes, planting seeds of Hope House and how to get out and where to look for help and before all that other stuff starts to set back in when somebody bonds out of jail.
From our side too, it's really important. You have that advocate that's there, that's on scene in the moment, but it becomes really important because the hours and the days after that immediacy of the crises is at least gives some matter of relief. We all know there could be a phone call. Hey, don't you say anything. Don't you do it. And all of a sudden that fear comes right back and then that control. So if we can break that and fill that void with foundational support and advocacy and honest human connection, then the sky's the limit really. And again, I think there's probably more success than we will ever know in just what we see. And I think we started the co-responder program specifically with mental health, putting social workers and embedding those in the police department out in the community. And I think everybody's initial reaction, just like with domestic violence, is, well, calls will go down. Well, that's not necessarily the case at all. The calls are the same, or even sometimes may go up because you might have people in different situations that know about those, so they now feel empowered to call. So calls may go up, but it's the level of the community impact and the services that are able to be provided, that's the true metric.
Yeah, and the other part about the co-responder is that then the co-responder and the officer will go back weekly, have a list of folks to go back and check up on them. So, okay, how are things going? What do you need? Just talk to them. And I think it's a world of difference when you have somebody responding back to check in on you, and it's a police officer and this advocate. Somebody out there cares about me. And I think that is just sometimes so lost, and they're just so broken that they can't think like that. They don't think that anybody cares. Everything their abuser has said is true, all those things, and just have this glimmer of hope show back up on your doorstep. Oh my gosh, maybe there is another way.
Can you just explain the persistent offenders, because we've used that term, and that's not necessarily a term that is common or people understand.
When we have persistent offenders, through the review process we talked about, they have a quarterly meeting and they review all incident reports and case reports that come through. And this is a meeting between prosecutors, Hope House advocates, the police department. So we have all of those pieces there at the table that are kind of a checks and balances, I guess probably would be a good one, that we're not over broadening somebody to put them on a somewhat list. And this started again. We have this with criminal offenders too. It's enshrined in law and statutes that have habitual offenders and chronic offenders. So this was just another tool in the domestic violence subsect of the criminal activity that says, okay, these individuals are what would be considered habitual offenders, or we call them persistent. They continue because they are persistent, as we've talked about, both in their control methods as well as their methods of abuse. And so it allows us to flag them in our system. And so when they are a persistent offender, it allows for enhanced penalties from the court process, as well as enhanced bonding requirements to be able to keep that offender locked up and away from their victim or victims for longer periods of time, to try to interject that advocacy and that means to be able to get an order of protection, get them into services, get them the help and support that they need, even if it's just to a family member's house for the evening. So it's just that extra tool that we have, but we don't use that lightly, obviously, and it's scrutinized heavily. It goes through this review process, and people come off of that list and people go onto that list very regularly based on their history.
And another thing that list or that process allows us to do, so if we are able to see there is something happening, 4 or 5 reports happening in a month. Okay, there's some escalation there, and that's what we're looking at. We are looking at the escalation of violence. Domestic violence is a crime. We are trying to prevent a homicide. And that's what that process is about, is we're seeing, you can lay out the police reports and you can say, oh wow, this person's violence is escalating. The next spot, someone's going to end up dead there. And that's what that's about, is really looking how to identify those and then connecting with those survivors, those victims, as soon as possible is so important, because we know that research shows to us, we know from our experiences, this is lethal. Someone's going to end up dead here, and we have got to get step in there and do something. Yep. That tool is what allows us that process.
Again, I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit, but we're doing so well dovetailing all these things together.
That's what we do.
That's it. Masters of it. I love it. Love it. So another piece of this process, the review and the scrutiny, we talk about the persistent offender. One of the things that this partnership, and really it truly is a partnership and it's a collaborative effort across the board and across the services in Jackson County for us specifically, which is nice. One of the things that came out of this review process was our domestic violence detectives, our Hope House advocates and partners, and then our city prosecutor realized, we were talking before we came on air about the ever-changing environment of technology. One of the things that we found was a gap in the city code that provided for one method of abuse, which is the removal of a cell phone that we all have, that wonderful device, and that's their access to call 911. Well, if they take that away and they can't physically get out because we've barricaded doors or we've secured houses or whatever, that's one more barrier. So what we have done is, through that process, our work with Ellen Greenberg Jacobs, our domestic violence prosecutor, has gone back and we have expanded our city code to make it a crime in the City of Independence to withhold that cellular device or that digital device. Really broaden that language out to any means. You can't restrict their access to people, you can't restrict their access to devices, and that's huge. I mean, again, it just adds another element for us to be able to help and support victims, but also hold suspects and offenders accountable for us trying to stay ahead of the game when it comes to their different methods of abuse.
I love the process that you saw something that needed to happen and it happens. What is the training process for a co-responder?
Well, it's a lot of relationship building. We can go through the documents and learn all the entry and all of that wonderful stuff, but it really starts with learning the officers, learning the police department, learning what's available and how to navigate through that. We keep talking about connections and making connections, and so that's the main piece right there when it comes to the co-responder and the officers working together. The more that they know about each other, it's better for the victim and the support that they're provided. The more the officer is educated on the services that are provided as well, and so they can continue with that. And all of the officers that our co-responder comes in contact with is building that relationship. They're building that relationship together so they're able to reach out to that victim and support them. But it's really riding around with the officer, because not only is it about the co-responder educating officers on domestic violence, the officers are educating the co-responder on what they do too. And I think that's really important, that we're learning all sides of it. It's not one-sided. Really, there's nothing that we have written down in stone. It looks different every day, and it's working different shifts at different times, working with different officers, and just being there. I think that's the really important thing, is just showing up and offering support for the most part.
Part of that, too, is when Randa says just being there. When you become part of the environment, you are more likely to be used as a resource because you're a part of the process to solve a problem. problem. So rather than just saying, oh, just call that phone number, or oh, here you go. No, you are ingrained in how things will look different. So I think that that's really important. The riding along, the relationships, it just gives that automatic response.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the trust that builds, you hit on the relationship, which is huge. You're not just a piece of paper, a number on a page. You're a human being, and you're there, and you're invested, and you take personal responsibility. The officers, just like they do, same with the co-responder. And then you develop that relationship, that trust, and that bond as part of, partners in this process, which only helps the community at large.
I'm so grateful for is that partnership, and it's changed over the years, but I think the change has been, and it's been getting deeper and it's more solidified. And I think that police often get criticized for the responses and particular call that maybe didn't go well, but I think too people don't understand the depth of what police do, and I'm hoping that that's what we really are hoping for with this process and this conversation, is to really be able to highlight how much you do and how much we rely on that and how much more we're able to give to those victims. And I think that's just really important, because I think you have talked at great in depth about what you and the officers do.
And I really appreciate you saying that, because you're right. A lot of times, and we can be our own worst enemy sometimes, because we don't necessarily want all the glory. We operate behind the scenes and just fill a need in the community, and that's what we take pride in, that dedication and service that we provide. And I'm so proud, which is not me, that is the men and women that are out there doing that work each and every day, not just in our community but in other communities. But the policing profession, it's a tough job, and it is tougher now than it ever was before. There was a time in our country and in our profession, which is good. Like anything else, we evolve and we get better. We look for ways to improve and become more efficient and more effective. But we expect these men and women who, again, largely, especially today's day and age, like before, are 21, 22, 23-year-old young adults, and we expect them to be constitutional scholars. We expect them to be mediators. We expect them to be counselors, professional counselors. We expect them to be all sorts of service. They're just so wide-ranging generalists, and it just amazes me. It amazes me the depth of compassion that these men and women have, the dedication to the community and the impact. And I think really at its core, that's why we work so well with Hope House. It really starts as a passion. You talk about the different processes and learning and evolving through that. None of those happen without a passion. You have to have that internal fire and that drive. So where we align, whether it be on the judicial side, the outreach side, at its core, it is the same mission, which is we want our communities to be the best that they possibly can, and we want to stand up for those that are being victimized and those that can't or won't stand up for themselves. That common link and that common passion that brings us all together and kind of binds us together is why these successes are able to show out.
As you was responding when you were an officer, what's the difference do you see now in the spot that you are?
That's a great question. I experienced some of that frustration too, that fatigue. So I did see that probably from a self-reflection point of view. It becomes frustrating because you can care too much, if that makes sense. And I don't mean that in the negative sense. It's that I know in my heart of hearts, I want nothing more than to, as much as I probably shouldn't say this on air, kidnap you and take you out of this situation and plant you in a safe environment and say, see, you can do this. But I know that I can't do that. So you keep responding back, and you try to meet these individuals, and you say, gosh, just what else can I do? I'll take paper till the cows come home if that's what it takes. I can't make this decision for you. I'm just there. And so as you mature and seeing what I see now, I lean directly to your point of as you go through the ranks, and especially sitting in the chief's job, I have the distinct honor and privilege of seeing the incredible work that these men and women do. The success story that I'm going to tell you about is one, literally just in the last month, and these are not rare. These happen, your perspective changes. So I get to see the whole landscape now and realize that passion is still very much alive. It really reinvigorates and re-energizes me as not only a police chief, but as somebody who can go out and speak about this in the community and be another advocate, not only just for our profession, but for you all and for our community as a whole. And I think you lose sight of that when you are so target focused, just on to the next call.
I think that comes back to what you said earlier, that all of the different roles you're supposed to play, that you're not social workers, you're not counselors, you don't necessarily know all the laws of everything. And I think that partly, to me, some of the disagreements or the anger, frustration that people have is because they don't understand all of the constraints and the different roles that you guys are all expected to play.
It was mentioned on one of the other podcasts with another chief that we talked to that you don't know where that officer just came from. They may have just came from knockdown, drag out fight with a armed robber at a gas station, and then they get this domestic violence call, and they have to flip that switch so quickly. I think that sometimes that grace isn't given to the officer because that officer is really a human being.
That's exactly right. And again, no different than any other human. We all are human beings. Yes, I think a lot of times so proud to see it each and every day. You know, they are heroes going out and, you know, they put on that uniform, and we call it the Superman cape, you know, a lot. There is a human being. There's a heart underneath of that. There's a brain. And just like all the rest of us, I mean, to make it relatable, think about what we all went through together collectively as a society during COVID, and that stress and the burden that took on, and really people, it forced you one way or the other. Either you survived and thrived, or hunkered down and it showed you, oh my gosh, realize some vulnerabilities that were there. So police are no different. We take that, call it secondary trauma, but there's this, you know, you take the trauma of those that you see, that those scenes that you can't unsee, those instances, but you got to pick up the pieces and you got to go be that hero for somebody else. And it's hard. It really is hard. It is, and it takes its toll. You know, we all start with a cup at the beginning of every day, and it has a certain level, and probably those 20, or 21, 22-year-olds, there's probably a quarter full, but you know, you add that years of experience and all of those calls that you handle, and you're probably at 3/4 a cup full. And at some point during the day, you know, there's only so much liquid that can be contained in that cup until it overflows. And remembering that and really humanizing the individuals that are behind that badge is really important.
I couldn't agree more. Speaking of victims, and when officers go on a call, it's not uncommon for our clients to be uncomfortable with law enforcement. What are some best practice steps that law enforcement can take to bridge that gap?
I think we've kind of hit on some of that already. Part of it is, again, with Randa and just that training component, that understanding. I will tell you, from IPD for 2023, we had 4,919 calls on average of 13 a day, reference to domestic violence and domestic disturbances. Again, that's why I think probably half is conservatively under. And out of that, now I will say as a caveat, not all of those calls was there found to be a crime that was committed, but we had 376 orders of protection service calls. That's just the service. And then we had an additional 320 orders of protection violation calls. So those are the actual violations of the order in place. We made 626 arrests for domestic violence related offenses, both felony and misdemeanor. And we say that because, again, when we talk about this fatigue, those are low in my mind. The 626 arrests out of 4,000, almost 5,000 calls is low. But we're finding through these processes that we have more repeat offenders, more persistent offenders, more. So that education, you know, linking it back to Randa and the training, is keeping those conversations going is so vital to us, because we will overcome those hurdles and we'll overcome those challenges, and we can continue to harken back to that victim mentality and that cycle of violence and just that compassion and understanding. Again, everything that we've talked about with the relationships with the co-responders, it's so important. But I cite those numbers not as a feather in our cap by any means, but just I want people to know, and your clients, you know, that are listening, that this is important work, and it's important to us, it's important to what we do, and we take it seriously. So.
I kind of want to add to that as well. In just from the co-responder, the importance of that follow-up and that ongoing, and you're talking about numbers and things like that, and you're exactly right. We can't see everything in numbers. But the co-responder in 2023 with the officers attempted to revisit 517 clients, victims of domestic violence, attempted to make that contact. Yeah. Of those 517, 202 were contacted. It's that ongoing support, and it's just remembering that the importance of keep on going, and it's not a one and done. And it's important that we remember that the purpose of this program is not for the numbers, it's to make that contact.
That's
so,
exactly right.
Yeah.
And remember that too, Randa, you know, the impressive thing because I didn't know those either, so that's awesome. I love it. But the impressive thing to me out of that is you're talking about people with regular full-time jobs.
Right.
So you have the initial incident that happens, and then
Right.
this is the follow-up incident, which is another 202 contacts, and those can take more than an hour sometimes, you know,
Right.
if you really build that connection and you know, have a need there. It's just, that's incredible
Right.
work.
And I would just touch on the work that I know that and we've been doing in collaboration with, but the Independence Police Department, your community outreach. You have your officers assigned out in Hawthorne, and they're very much a part of the community activities out there. So there's another way for officers to kind of become approached or make those relationships, and you don't always have to come on a 911 call. You know, that's the only experience, and that means something bad's happening. So the Hawthorne, I know you have your Night Out Against Crime. You do a lot of community work there. You do a lot of work with the school district. You're attending their public fairs and those kinds of things. I think that also is another way, and we're tagging along because we also know that not everybody just wants to dial 911 or call our hotline. They follow up on us as part of some other process. We are now starting to build those connections a different way, and so we have to also be able to be open to being a part of different ways. You do your trunk or treat. Oh my gosh, you know how many kids come through your trunk or treat? That's lines up around the block and 5 blocks over. And we're a part of that as well. And there's other community partners. It's behind trunk or treat, but really you're making connections you don't even know that you're making.
It's twofold, and there's so many layers, like anything else we talk about, that we get multiple layers of wins there, and you're exactly right. So we get the positive police interactions with kids and adults alike. That way it isn't only when you need, you're in crisis or calling 911 for an emergency that you see the police. You actually see us out there embedded as part of the fabric of the community, which is really important to us. The other win is, you're exactly right. How many times have we had, and I wish I had a number on this, but the untold stories, the ones that you say, okay, a victim didn't even know I was a victim of domestic violence or some other crime, and I would never have known that. I would have gone through my entire life and never have reported or not even had the education or awareness to even know, because this is just normal. It may not be pervasive, it may not be severe, it just may be known as life to me. But through these community interactions, has nothing to do with the, hey, come to us. It's part of that meet you where you are. Sometimes that's completely unassuming and completely innocent, and how cool is that, if you can really have a profound impact on somebody's life for the better through just a happenstance meeting.
Absolutely.
And I think it goes back to that relationship piece, Randa, that you were talking about with the co-responders and the officers. Would be the co-responders, the officers with the community. Relationship, I think, is everything.
And what if you learn, you might have a referral too. I just thought about that piece of it too. It may not be you. Maybe it's a friend or another family member or somebody else, and you're like, oh my gosh, I've seen, just through conversation, you're like, hey, I've seen this. Wait a minute, I just had this conversation with Eileen at trunk or treat, and I got all these warning signs, this is this person and this person. All of a sudden now you have that where you may not have had the confidence or the, knowledge to intervene before. Maybe now you become that advocate for that person. Wherever we can embed and have a positive impact, our community's better off for it.
We've been hearing the story teaser now
ready?
2 or 3 times. I am ready.
I'm
All right.
Let's go.
Okay, this was just last month, and again, it just shows you how something on its face that doesn't present as something that it may be at first can turn into something else. And with the collaborative efforts that we have, the partnership with Hope House, this turned into a difference for the independence community, and I'll tell you that. So this was on December the 17th. We got a call, and it turns out that we had a couple calls regarding a subject who had been seen the night prior firing off a gun in the neighborhood. Not tying those together, goes to the next day, and we have an individual who ends up being our victim, who is a repeat victim of domestic violence. It's one of those cases that we talk about that's tough for the officers. As soon as I read this and read the name, it was an individual that I remember from being that officer on the street. I have dealt with this family, so this is long standing. So we get there, we find out that there was a DV assault that occurred, and obviously now we have this individual that has access to weapons. So it goes into our lethality assessment, and we're able to do that screening. Well, he has since fled the scene, and this person is a felon, a multiple time over felon, not allowed to have weapons, not allowed to possess weapons. So we have certain things that are now all starting to come together. Initially, our victim was very scared just because of the years of abuse and cycle of violence there. So she had fled to a neighbor's house and initially did not want to cooperate, did not want to be involved, which we see. I mean, that's typical. Through that relationship and through partnership, we started to realize, okay, hey, there's more here. Like, this is dangerous. Again, to Eileen's point, exactly, this is escalating. So we get more details, and it turns out that there was a random car that just happened to be driving down the street the night before, and this individual fires up around towards that car, completely random, and then goes back inside the house. So through that, further investigation, the officer says, okay, there's more to this. He's left. We end up broadcasting that information out, and we're able to go get the offender in custody. We were able to locate him in the neighborhood, get him in custody, at which point we knew, based on the video that we had from the neighbors, video doorbells, ring doorbells, and video surveillance, we were able to piece that together to get a search warrant to get back into the house where we found the guns. And simultaneously, while we effected the arrest of him and we're investigating that and serving the search warrant, we were able to link up with Hope House and get an emergency ex parte. We got that served, and so that was excellent just to back that up, which helped the case there. He's a multiple time felon and was remanded into federal custody and awaits their still waiting trial. But I will tell you that this was all done from what started as a random possible shots fired incident turns into that relationship of, okay, we just got to pry a little bit more, just pull a little bit more out. Okay, now how can we help you? And it was really a neighborhood response, again, over multiple years. This family is well known to us, so now we maybe have finally broken that cycle for the first time in well over a decade, these individuals.
That is so commendable.
Yeah, no wonder you wanted to share it.
I know.
Wow.
Yeah, that is a mic drop moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This one is profound just because it took a lot of units coming together. We involved the ATF to go back and try to backtrack to make sure that we didn't leave a gun out in the community. So, I mean, this one was really a really cool moment and story for us to highlight. But this is happening day in and day out. Maybe not to this level and to this effect, but it's happening each time we go out and we deal with these calls. And that wouldn't be possible without all of you investing in us as partners in this community, and investing in our officers and that training and education, our community as a whole, you know, the victims in our community as well.
Thank you for your service, Chief Dustman. Thank the Independence Police Department as well.
Thank you very much.